September 2001 changed lives forever, not only for Americans, but for people all over the world. On September 11th, at 8:46 a.m., one of the American Airlines planes crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At that moment, hundreds of journalists were already pointing their cameras at the burning building. Soon, millions of Americans were watching the tragedy unfold live on television. Just minutes later, a second plane hit the South Tower. In total, suicide terrorists hijacked 4 passenger airliners over the eastern United States. They turned them into massive guided bombs, and nearly all of them reached their targets. The 9/11 attacks are considered the deadliest, largest scale, and most meticulously planned terrorist attacks in modern history. Almost 3,000 people were killed. More than 25,000 were injured. Those attacks gave rise to countless conspiracy theories and triggered a chain of events that still affects the world today, including Europe. The world was split into before and after. Absolutely everything changed. Hello everyone. My name is Alex Blackwood, and you're watching Behind the Scenes of Power. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope that if you subscribe to this channel, you'll stay with us for a long time. In this video, I'll tell you what really happened on September 11th, what Al-Qaeda is and why it chose to attack the United States, how terrorists managed to hijack 4 planes at once, which conspiracy theories emerged after 9/11, whether these attacks influenced racism and crime in the US, how America decided to respond, and why the so-called War on Terror still impacts Europe today. You can support this video with a like or a comment. According to data from the American Medical Association, by August 2002, less than a year after the attacks, 11% of New York City residents were already suffering from PTSD. And that's not even counting sleep disorders, concentration problems, heightened sensitivity, fear, and anxiety. Among those 11%, PTSD became chronic in half of the cases, and depression intensified as well. Another year later, in 2003, after working with psychologists and therapists, that number was reduced to 3%. Therapy is a powerful thing. To understand how all of this began, we need to start with Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda and the man responsible for the attacks. Long before 9/11, in 1957, Osama was born the son of a wealthy Saudi businessman. He was an ordinary kid who went to a regular school, then a regular university, until he dropped out in 1979. That same year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Bin Laden immediately joined the Mujahideen fighting against Soviet forces. At first, his role was mostly logistical, providing funding, equipment, and weapons. He was rich, and he could afford it. By the late 1980s, the USSR withdrew from Afghanistan. That should have been the end of the story. But instead, bin Laden grew more influential than ever. In 1988, he founded a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, which, translated from Arabic, means the base or the foundation. And so, the newly created Al-Qaeda was meant to carry on the cause of jihad, a so-called holy war, through violence and terror. As an organization, Al-Qaeda grew extremely fast, fueled by massive financial backing. Training camps and schools for future fighters began to appear. They operated in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sudan. By the early 1990s, the first terrorist attacks had already begun, assaults and bombings aimed at spreading the group's ideology. At the core of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden embedded a deep hatred toward the United States and everything associated with it. He openly opposed the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia and Somalia, but the Americans had no intention of leaving. So bin Laden began developing plans to attack and terrorize U.S. forces. Unfortunately, Osama bin Laden was a highly effective manipulator. He skillfully used cultural and religious references from the Quran, telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Who was responsible for Muslims living in poverty? The Americans. Who was to blame for once proud nations now being oppressed? Again, the Americans. His speeches drew from many sources: Islam, history, politics, and especially the region's economic instability. All of this, combined with selective interpretations of the Quran, became the foundation bin Laden used to instill hatred and radicalize his followers. And this is crucial to understand. All of this was happening during a time of growing unrest across the Middle East. One after another, revolutions and uprisings erupted in Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. Radical groups came to power, blaming all of their problems on the Western world. Social and economic instability, especially among young people who couldn't find decent work under corrupt, oil-rich regimes, made them an easy target for radicalization. Osama bin Laden's message that America was the head of the snake and the root of all problems resonated deeply with public sentiment. By the mid-1990s, he had transformed al-Qaeda into a highly sophisticated terrorist network, one capable of repeatedly striking American targets across the Middle East. They became Washington's primary enemy, and adapting to fight them proved extremely difficult. This was not a conventional war. The attacks were often isolated, unpredictable, and frequently carried out by suicide bombers. The U.S. intelligence community was simply not prepared for this kind of warfare. They knew an attack could happen at any moment, but the uncertainty was even worse. You never knew where the next strike would come from, or how devastating it might be. Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for numerous terrorist attacks throughout the 1990s. Among them were the bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, as well as the attack on the American warship USS Cole in 2000. In addition, Al-Qaeda militants began absorbing other terrorist groups and organizing attacks through their networks. One of Al-Qaeda's major attacks against the United States took place as early as 1998. That year, the group carried out near-simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. The attacks killed more than 200 people and injured over 4,500 others. Even then, Osama bin Laden was formally charged with conspiracy to murder U.S. citizens abroad. Honestly, it was a bleak situation, and the response was relatively weak. But there was one major problem. No one knew where bin Laden was hiding. Eventually, several al-Qaeda operatives were arrested. At the time, this was seen as an almost unbelievable success. Encouraged by these developments, the United States stepped up its counterterrorism efforts. In 1999, the FBI created its first dedicated counterterrorism division. That same year, Osama bin Laden was added to the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. And yet, before the September 11th attacks, most ordinary Americans had barely heard of him. He was largely unknown to the public. That lack of widespread attention may have been one of the reasons al-Qaeda was able to grow into a powerful, global terrorist network. By September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda already had the ability to operate training camps, gather intelligence, remotely coordinate operations across the world, secure funding, and plan large-scale attacks. They had everything they needed to carry out the largest terrorist attack in history. According to the U.S. 9/11 Commission, the terrorists needed just 2 years to prepare for the attack on the United States. It all began in 1999 with the training of 4 pilots, men who would later guide hijacked planes toward their predetermined targets. By the summer of 2000, 3 of the 4 terrorists had arrived on the U.S. East Coast, where they began taking flight training. In early 2001, one of them even completed advanced aviation courses. In reality, al-Qaeda operatives had been present in the United States since the early 1990s. At this point, a logical question might come to mind. Did this raise any suspicions? Of course it did. 4 men suddenly enrolling in accelerated flight training, all while al-Qaeda was openly threatening to carry out attacks on U.S. soil, not somewhere on the periphery as before. In fact, one of these suicide pilots was even arrested. That happened on August 16, 2001, less than a month before the attacks. Even then, it was already clear that something terrible was coming. Intelligence reports warned that terrorists previously spotted in Southeast Asia had now arrived in the United States. Former CIA Director George Tenet later recalled that everything was red. Every warning light was flashing. The U.S. was being told repeatedly that terrorists were planning something large-scale and unprecedented. But the White House chose a different strategy. They focused on confronting al-Qaeda abroad. Meanwhile, domestic security was largely overlooked. And here's what's interesting. As the final preparations for the attack were underway that summer, even the terrorists themselves were divided. The Taliban leadership believed that attacking inside the United States was a mistake. In their view, the fight should be limited to Americans who brought weapons into Arab lands. Osama bin Laden thought differently. For him, this attack had already been planned long ago. The 9/11 attacks cost the terrorists up to $500,000 in total, More than $270,000 of that was spent directly inside the United States. The terrorists opened bank accounts in their own names, used their real passports and official identification documents. Their money transfers raised no suspicion and went completely unnoticed. After all, billions of dollars move through U.S. banks every single day. By the way, even today, the U.S. Commission investigating the attacks has never been able to determine exactly where the terrorists got that much money, and that's despite the fact that Al-Qaeda's annual budget before September 11th was estimated at $30 million. So even if one specific source of funding had dried up or disappeared, the terrorists would have found money elsewhere. Now, as for the attacks themselves. September 11th began with 19 operatives passing through airport security at different airports and cities across the United States, without any serious issues. At the time, strict pre-boarding security checks simply didn't exist, so once the hijackers boarded the planes and they took off, they were able to seize control. Passenger airliners turned into massive, fuel-loaded bombs. 4 aircraft were intended to be flown into buildings of major symbolic importance to the United States. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the Capitol. The first 3 reached their targets. The 4th never made it to the Capitol and crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, only because the passengers fought back. But let's go step by step. One of the hijackers of Flight 11, Mohammed Atta, accidentally alerted air traffic controllers in Boston that he intended to fly the plane into the North Tower. It was unintentional. He had meant to press the button to address the passengers, to tell them that they were all going to die. After hearing Mohammed Atta's transmission from Flight 11, Boston Air Traffic Control immediately alerted the Northeast Air Defense Sector. They mobilized the Air National Guard, which scrambled fighter jets to pursue the hijacked aircraft. But did it make any difference? No. Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at approximately 8:46 a.m., striking around the 98th floor. Just minutes later, Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower, hitting roughly the 85th floor. This second impact was caught on camera. Journalists were already filming the aftermath of the first strike, and now millions of Americans were watching the attack unfold live on television. At the moment the planes hit the towers, thousands of people were inside. Almost no one who was above the impact zones survived. A massive fire erupted immediately. Trapped on the upper floors, people had no way out. Some jumped from the buildings. There were simply no other options. At that very moment, then-President George W. Bush was visiting an elementary school in Florida. His chief of staff leaned in and whispered to him that terrorists had just hit the second tower. I decided not to panic and not to leave the classroom. I didn't want to frighten the children. It was important to create a sense of calm. I had been in many crisis situations before, and I knew that the first thing a leader must do is project calm. When planes are falling from the sky, creating a sense of calm becomes an almost impossible task. Especially after both towers were hit and Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, everyone on board was killed, along with 125 people who were inside the western section of the U.S. Department of Defense headquarters at the moment of impact. After that, U.S. authorities made the decision to shut down the entire airspace under Operation Yellow Ribbon. All aircraft, especially civilian ones, were ordered to land immediately. Otherwise, they would be shot down. At that moment, the only aircraft allowed to remain airborne was the presidential plane, Air Force One, with George W. Bush on board. By then, all planes, hijacked by the terrorists, had already crashed. The last one, Flight 93, went down in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. No one knows for certain, but the commission believes the plane was headed for either the White House or the Capitol. Thanks to the passengers, it never reached its target. A struggle broke out on board, and the aircraft crashed. President George W. Bush authorized the military to shoot down any aircraft if necessary. However, by that moment, all 4 planes hijacked by the terrorists had already crashed. It's likely that the president's team issued this order believing that Flight 93 was still in the air. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld then ordered U.S. forces to move to a heightened state of readiness, DEFCON 3. By the way, there are 5 DEFCON levels. DEFCON 5 is the normal state of readiness used in peacetime. DEFCON 1 is the highest possible level, indicating maximum readiness and the potential use of weapons of mass destruction. The United States has never reached DEFCON 1, except during training exercises. But back to the attacks. Less than 15 minutes after the first plane hit the tower, the building completely collapsed. A massive cloud of dust, smoke, and fire engulfed the city. Ground Zero was reduced to ruins. Soon after, the second tower fell as well. Only 18 people who were above the impact zones inside the World Trade Center survived. What's important to note is that these buildings were engineered to withstand wind speeds of up to 200 miles per hour. Even powerful fires alone were not supposed to bring down structures of this scale. This fact would later give rise to numerous conspiracy theories, which we'll talk about a bit later. The September 11th attacks were carried out by 19 men, all members of Al-Qaeda. In the media, they became known as the hijackers, a term still used today. Rescue efforts began immediately. Doctors, police officers, firefighters, sanitation workers, ordinary civilians, thousands of first responders and volunteers rushed to help. There is no exact number. Animals were involved as well. This was Tracker, a German shepherd, and his handler, James Symington. They served in a police search and rescue unit. Tracker specialized in detecting explosives and contraband, and had helped seize illegal substances worth over $1 million during his career. But that's not what the world remembers him for. In 2001, Tracker was about to retire. At the time, U.S. regulations required service dogs to be euthanized after retirement. His handler took time off to spend what he believed would be their final days together, to say goodbye peacefully. Then September 11th happened. While emergency services searched the rubble, Symington and Tracker began searching on their own. Tracker detected signs of life beneath the debris. It was Janelle Guzman, the last person pulled alive from the ruins. She survived. Tracker, however, was hospitalized due to burns, dust inhalation, and extreme exhaustion. Many rescuers later suffered from long-term health problems, mental illness, heart and lung disease. The dust, debris, intense heat, and collapsing structures left injuries that would stay with them for life. Time magazine included Tracker on its list of the most heroic animals in history. In 2005, Tracker and his handler, James Symington, were awarded Dog of the Year for extraordinary service to humanity. Not long after that, Tracker lost the use of his hind legs. For the rest of his life, he moved around in a wheelchair. Everyone understood that sooner or later Tracker would pass away, due to age and the injuries he had suffered. So his handler decided to donate Tracker's DNA to a laboratory in South Korea for cloning. Normally, such a procedure costs at least $100,000. But in memory of Tracker, who passed away in 2009, the scientists agreed to do it for free. As a result, 5 puppies were cloned: Trust, Solace, Valor, Prodigy, and Deja Vu. Each was named to reflect a specific trait. Trust was always focused, Solace was curious, Valor was brave, Prodigy was intelligent, and Deja Vu, well, the name speaks for itself. All 5 dogs went on to become search and rescue dogs, continuing Tracker's legacy. By the way, the New York Times later published a major feature on rescue animals who searched for survivors during the attacks, and in many cases, gave their lives to save others. When it comes to the human toll of the September 11th attacks, the officially accepted number of victims is 2,977 people, not counting the 19 terrorists. You may also see the number 2,996 mentioned. That figure includes the hijackers. More than 20,000 people were injured. At the World Trade Center, 2,606 people were killed either instantly or later died from their injuries. At the Pentagon, 125 people lost their lives. The youngest victim was just 2 years old. The oldest was 82. At the moment the planes struck the towers, there were approximately 17,500 people inside the 2 buildings, citizens of 77 different countries. New York City alone lost 441 emergency responders. The U.S. economy suffered damages estimated at $10 billion, and the shockwaves were felt across global markets. Wall Street remained closed until September 17th. Clearing ground zero of debris and rubble was completed only in May 2002. The Pentagon was fully restored within a year. The attacks also had a profound impact on air travel. For the next 3 years, more than 10 million Americans chose cars or trains instead of flying. That only began to change after stricter airport security measures were introduced, removing belts and shoes, limits on liquids, bans on sharp objects, and arriving hours early for screening became the new normal. Today, where the Twin Towers once stood, rises One World Trade Center, officially opened in early November 2014. And now we can talk about how the United States, as a country, responded to the attacks. It began with a presidential address, a firm declaration that America
would now commit itself to eradicating terrorism.
Any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. Suspicion immediately fell on al-Qaeda. Its leader, Osama bin Laden, was hiding in Afghanistan under Taliban protection. The U.S. demanded that the Taliban hand him over, warning that otherwise their bases would be destroyed. The Taliban refused. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a global campaign against terrorism that began in Afghanistan. The operation opened with massive airstrikes. B-2 and B-52 bombers, followed by F-14S and F/A-18S, dropped tens of thousands of bombs on militant targets. But these campaigns proved only partly effective. More success came from targeted special operations. In the years after 9/11, the U.S. deployed troops worldwide to combat terrorism directly and trained foreign militaries, sometimes with real results. In 2003, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, widely regarded as the chief planner of 9/11, was captured in Pakistan. He remains held at Guantanamo Bay, still awaiting trial due to the difficulty of building a legally sufficient case. Bin Laden, however, evaded capture for years. His end came in 2011 when U.S. Special Forces located and killed him in Pakistan. Only after his body was identified did officials officially announce that the leader of al-Qaeda and mastermind of 9/11 had been eliminated. In 2014, President Barack Obama officially announced the end of Operation Enduring Freedom. Over its 13 years, nearly 2 million U.S. service members were deployed, and many lost their lives in the global war on terror. The human cost became the main reason the operations were eventually brought to an end. Since 2001, more than 3,500 coalition troops were killed, including around 2,300 American service members. Over 20,000 more were wounded. These losses were far smaller than those suffered by Afghan forces. In 2019, Afghanistan's president stated that 45,000 Afghan soldiers had been killed in just the previous 5 years. Researchers from Brown University estimate the true number is much higher, between 64,000 and 100,000 Afghan military personnel killed between 2001 and 2019. The same researchers estimate that the United States spent about $2.3 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, including loans, military pay, and long-term veteran benefits. In April 2017, the U.S. dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb ever used in combat on jihadist positions in Afghanistan. Known as the Moab, mother of all bombs, the strike reportedly killed 96 militants. The bomb, developed in the early 2000s, is guided by satellite navigation, measures 9 meters in length, weighs 9.5 tons, and carries nearly 8.5 tons of high explosive. The Moab produces a blast radius of over 1.5 kilometers in all directions. Because of its size, it must be dropped from the rear of a heavy cargo aircraft using a parachute. No standard U.S. military plane can carry it internally. The development of the Moab was estimated at $300 million in the early 2000s. Today, the United States reportedly has up to 15 of these bombs, each costing around $16 million. As for how America's involvement in Afghanistan ended, the outcome is well known. In 2021, the U.S. announced its troop withdrawal, and just 3 months later, the Taliban regained full control of the country. The force the U.S. had fought for 2 decades returned to power. This was tragic, but not unexpected. Yet the real issue isn't whether the U.S. should have withdrawn. It's the consequences of intervening in Afghanistan in the first place. Operation Enduring Freedom, despite its declared goals, opened the door to global-scale confrontations. After World War II, international law, established by the UN Security Council, was built on the principle that states should engage in war only in self-defense. The United States justified its invasion of Afghanistan as self-defense under the War on Terror. In 2001, George W. Bush declared that the U.S. would fight anyone who supported or sheltered terrorism. But in 2003, Washington went further, invading Iraq under a new concept, the doctrine of preventive war. This doctrine justified military action not in response to an attack, but to prevent a potential future one, especially involving weapons of mass destruction. That moment became a warning sign. Once such a doctrine exists, other states can adopt it, launching wars quickly and easily under legal justifications that are often highly questionable. You can see where this is going. The UN General Assembly itself acknowledges that even if preventive war could be justified, it carries serious long-term risks. The country that initiates such a war ends up winning either way, even if it later must prove the attack was necessary. It can always claim that the original threats were already eliminated. It's a no-lose scenario. As in 2003, so it remains today. Unilateral preventive use of force undermines the credibility, relevance, and purpose of the UN Security Council in maintaining global peace and stability. And now, the final, but no less important part of the 9/11 story, conspiracy theories. One of the most famous and persistent theories appeared just hours after the attacks and quickly spread through early internet forums. An important clarification. I do not support any conspiracy theories. I'm only describing which ones exist. Supporters of this theory argued that the towers collapsed too quickly and claimed that explosives must have been planted on the lower floors. Otherwise, how could both buildings fall almost perfectly straight down? Later, they even cited supposed witnesses who claimed explosions were heard after the plane struck, blasts so powerful that debris was thrown into the streets. The official report states that the towers collapsed because of severe structural damage from the aircraft impacts and the intense fires that followed. Supporters of conspiracy theories reject this explanation, arguing that the fires did not last long enough to cause a full collapse. For example, the South Tower burned for only 56 minutes before it fell. It's important to note that unilateral actions, often justified under the doctrine of preventive war, do occur in practice. In some cases, they are openly supported, or quietly tolerated, by member states of the Council of Europe, as they are seen as the lesser of two evils. This is partly due to the weaknesses of the UN system of collective security, which often struggles to respond quickly and effectively, even to serious threats to international peace and security. Supporters of the conspiracy theory argue that the attacks were used as a pretext to justify the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, allegedly motivated by oil interests. Almost immediately after the attacks, as early as 2002, protests erupted across the United States with slogans accusing President Bush of responsibility. Some politicians demanded an investigation to answer two questions. What did the administration know and when did it know it? In opinion polls during the first decade after 9/11, a notable share of respondents, especially Democrats, believed the attacks were part of a conspiracy used to justify U.S. invasions abroad. A 2006 poll showed that 23% of Democrats found such a conspiracy very likely, 29% somewhat likely, and 49% unlikely. Among Republicans, belief in conspiracies was much lower. More extreme theories also emerged. One claimed the attacks were orchestrated by Jews to turn the U.S. against Muslims, an anti-Semitic allegation with no evidence. Another theory accused Saudi Arabia, arguing that 19 terrorists could not have carried out the attacks alone. Saudi Arabia denied involvement, and the official investigation found no proof. Still, suspicion persisted because 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals, with the others from the UAE, Egypt, and Lebanon. All were Muslims, and this fueled growing hostility in the U.S. not only toward Islam, but toward Muslims themselves, including long-standing law-abiding citizens. Hate crimes surged sharply, from 12 attacks in 2000 to 93 in 2001. Just 12 days after 9/11, a man killed a gas station owner of Indian origin, mistaking him for a Muslim because he wore a turban. First, Frank Roque shot and killed the gas station owner. About 20 minutes later, he tried to shoot a store clerk of Lebanese descent, but missed. He then fired several shots at the home of an Afghan family, again missing. Roque was charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. And this is just one example involving a single individual. Overall, according to the Pew Research Center, hate-based attacks against Muslims in the United States increased by 50% compared to pre-9/11 levels. and this trend persisted even 15 years after the attacks. So, what conclusions can we draw? The U.S. response to 9/11 did not eliminate al-Qaeda. The organization still exists and operates in countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and even in Russia. The Taliban, whom the United States fought for years, were not destroyed either. Today, they operate relatively freely and even take part in diplomatic meetings, including with Russia. In August 2022, a U.S. drone strike killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. In practice, however, this changed very little. The organization continues to exist, and many politicians around the world, including in the United States, fear that its militants could one day strike American soil again, possibly on an even larger scale. And with that, thank you for watching this video to the end. Like it or dislike it, leave a comment, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to help the channel grow. See you later.